This video is brought to you by VIP Zhou 8, the only true Imperial by Zhou. The journey of VIP Zhou 8's rebirth started in northern England, and has unfolded across multiple continents, with amazing highs and life-threatening lows. It involves a series of events that have led to the rebirth of a 300-year-old Imperial Chinese liquor, that hails from within the walls of the Forbidden City. The VIP Zhou 8 recipe consists of 9 ingredients personally selected by the Kangxi Emperor. The recipe had lain hidden for 300 years, that is until destiny, luck, fate or whatever you want to call it played a hand. Join Irv Graham at the very start of his adventure by reading the full story at vipzhou8.com.
Unlike other parts of the world where the rise of bronze culture can be seen in the development of weapons and tools for practical use, the bronze culture of ancient China was centered on religious activities. In their governing of the country, and for that purpose, the rulers of the Western Zhou Dynasty during the 11th century BC devised rigid rules about the use of these ritual bronze objects. In the process, 2 abstract concepts emerged, Li and Yue. While Li translates into English as behavior code and social etiquette, the term Li implied much more than this phrase suggests, and Yue, which translates as music, covered a wider range than suggested by the word music. The strong belief in Li and Yue distinguished ancient Chinese civilization from any other in the world, and the social norms and protocols that were born out of them were passed down through history to be followed by later generations, even to the present day. More than 2,000 years ago, some Han Dynasty scholars said, China is a nation of virtues and social etiquette. To some extent, the concept of Li covers every aspect of Chinese society, including politics, history and culture, and there is no equivalent term in any Western language.
"中国是礼乐之国啊，礼仪之邦，可以说是从中国文明开始萌芽形成的时候起，就带有这种以礼乐制度作为它特色的这样一种现象啊。中国人所讲的礼仪，实际上呢是非常之广泛，它体现了社会的结构和社会的种种特点，也体现了社会的统一性和普遍性。那么在这些方面说起来的话呢，和其他的国家呢，确实有些很大的不同。我们中国所谓的礼仪是吧，和外国的一般的讲的这个形式的一些个礼仪，其实意义也不完全相同。
When did the Chinese belief in Li and Yue begin? To trace the beginnings, we have to go back more than 4,000 years to the era of Yao and Shun, 2 rulers in ancient antiquity. In Xiangfen County, Shanxi Province, can be seen the remains of Taosi Temple. Here, 4,600 years ago, a culture was born, and it flourished for around 500 years at the same time as Longshan culture further down the Yellow River in present-day Shandong Province. More than 1,300 tombs were found here, but only a few dozen contained large amounts of precious burial items. This tells us that during the era in which these people lived, the society was divided into social classes in which distinctions between rich and poor were clearly delineated. These color pottery objects found among the Taosi relics marked the social status of their owners. Also excavated were many jade objects for religious use, and they're very similar to those from the Yangtze culture of 5,000 years ago.
有的墓葬里，除了刚才我们说到了有些礼乐性质的这个器物，你比方说它有这个古书叫土鼓啊，土鼓就是用陶制成的一种鼓，是吧？它那鼓呢很高，是个柱形的，是吧？上面用鹅鱼皮啊，这个就短吻鹅啊，就是一种这个鹅鱼皮上蒙面这样的一种乐器。这种乐器你可以看到，它一定有一定的礼仪的性质。是吧？你比方说他出的这个陶盘中间的这个大家都看得非常有名的，它中间画了一条盘龙，是吧？那么龙这种这个动物，它本身并不是自然界存在的，是吧？它是呢当时的人的一种信仰神话的一种具象带有很重要的这个信仰的意义。所以这些方面我们都看到，这个礼仪的发展在当时不但是萌芽，而且已经到了一定的这个高度了那么一直为这个商周时期的高度发展的礼仪制度呢打下了一个很好的基础。
Cultural features of the Yellow River and Yangtze River areas can be seen in the Taosi relics. Among them are sets of large objects for use at funeral and religious ceremonies. The tuo drum and stone qiang, both of which are musical percussion instruments, were once hung up in a hall. Like ceremonial wine and food containers, they were used only at worship ceremonies. As was the case with worship ceremonies in ancient China, there were strict rules for the use of Li and Yue objects. In October 2000, archaeologists made their way to the site of the Chanzashan relics in Chefeng in Mongolia. To contemporary people, this large site with its many stone and earthen enclosures seems quite eerie. Astonishingly, in the ancient past, the central area of this site covered 6.6 thousand square meters. At first, experts felt that the site may have been built for military defense purposes. But if so, who had built it and from whom were they defending themselves? Perhaps some large-scale war had taken place here. Further investigation of the site revealed that the enclosures, which contain only piles of rocks, had not been built for people to live in. Had this place, called by the locals the Ancient Castle, been a place of worship for some ancient kingdom in China's north? From the ground and without the aid of explanations from the local people, the site seems to consist of nothing more than piles of rocks. However, a view from the air reveals something else entirely. The rocks form a huge pattern comprising several hundred geometric shapes. This site is, in fact, the largest of all religious sites thus far found in China. Although it is just one of 10 similar sites found in Chanzashan, this one has the most altars. This religious site was in use some 4,000 years ago, about the same time as the Zhou Dynasty. During the Shang and Zhou dynasties that followed the Xia, humanistic thinking began to appear, and the concepts of Li and Yue began to govern political and social behavior. When King Wu of Zhou, a ruler in China's west, engaged in a punitive expedition against King Zhou of the Shang Dynasty, he proclaimed 3 charges against the latter: disregard of the codes of behavior instituted by the ancestors, disrespect of heaven and the gods, and cruelty to the people. All 3 charges made against King Zhou of Shang represent transgressions against the concepts of Li and Yue.
在武王克上之前，这个周跟殷商的这个国力的差别是非常大的啊。那么这商呢是地处中原腹地，一个相当发达的青铜文明啊。所以周人在他这个胜利之后，甚至还说他自己是小邦周，这个商朝是大邦殷。他这个经济上他非常发达。 可是他在精神领域里面，他一片空白，啊。那么我们说贾国里可以知道，他是不问苍生问鬼神，什么事情都要占卜。这个物质文化的发达，如果没有人文精神的引领，最后这个社会要走向灭亡。
The punitive expedition authorized by King Wu received considerable support from many of the local rulers. Holding high the banner of respecting heaven and protecting the populace, King Wu's army set off from the capital of Gaojin and quickly pushed forward to the Shang capital. One of the significant academic results of the early 21st century was the establishment of the exact year of King Wu's punitive expedition. Fortunately, the year was included in an inscription on a huge bronze drum that had been specially made to commemorate the success of the mission. After the area was rid of the old ruler, in the new and relatively united country, the people began leading a happy life, while the notion of respecting heaven and the ancestors and protecting the populace took root in the way the nation was governed.
你比方说，啊，他在里面提到，物与水见，当与民见。啊，就是你这个执政的这个贵族，啊，你不要拿这个水啊当镜子。大家知道这个鉴嘛，对吧？以史为鉴，以铜为鉴。你要拿老百姓当鉴子，以民为鉴。啊，这就是以民为本啊。另外说，天视。 这电视的事，天视自我民视，老天他看到什么，就是我们人民看到什么，老天就看到什么，天听自我民听，啊，这样一种精神在2000多年前这个中国出现，我觉得非常伟大，因为在这个时候，古希腊还处在神话时代。
The question became how to go about effectively governing a state that was much larger than theirs had been, much larger even than the old state of Shang they had overthrown. The rulers of the Western Zhou Dynasty came up with an ingenious idea, establishing a system of fiefdoms. In the early years of the Western Zhou Dynasty, the ruler created more than 70 fief states, 50 of which were ruled by people who had Ji as their surname, all from his own clan. It marked, in fact, the birth of a nation made up of various ethnic groups, in which the Cathay people formed the majority. But with so many fief states, some of them quite distant, how could the country be properly developed? The younger brother of King Wu, Lord Dan of Zhou, came up with a set of rules to cover almost every aspect of the nation: social, religious, political, and economic.
Ah, 周公是我们历史上一个非常杰出的政治家，啊，那么他在这个武王克商之后就总结。 啊，这个殷人亡国的教训，就他这个车怎么翻了，他前车之鉴是什么？啊，那么他经过总结呢，就发现主要的、根本的原因就是他们呢，失德。那么失德就失人心，失人心就亡天下。所以他后来周公就要制定一系列以道德作为核心的这个 制度。那么我们历史上把这样一套制度叫做治理作乐。
The code built around Li and Yue was developed to the point where it could be seen in every activity engaged in by the people, whether it be funerals, burials, social activities, wars, or celebrations. The nature of this Li and Yue system meant that it reminded people that they belonged to a particular social stratum and that they had a code to live by.
那么这个道德呢，一般来说它是一个很抽象的看不见摸不着的东西。可是我们这个前辈很聪明，他把这个德这个东西，它分解成了很多个德目，每一个德目都是可以操作的比方诚信孝顺那么你在实践这个礼的过程当中，你就一步一步的成为了一个理性的人，从行为上、言谈举止上来规范你所以这个礼它是修身的，是吧？比方见到老年人应该怎么样，见到长辈应该怎么样，是吧？见到老师应该怎么样，然后在人家家里出现不幸的事情，比方丧礼，你应该怎么样那么使你呢这个始终能够想到自己的行为应该是理性的。
After the Shang dynasty fell to the Zhou dynasty, the new dynasty had two small states on its borders, one named Yu, the other Rui. The land between these two small states was very fertile, and they had long been locked in a battle over ownership of this tract of land, resulting, of course, in a massive waste of manpower and resources. One day, the rulers of both states came to the capital of Zhou in the hope of settling the dispute by getting a judgment from King Wen, the ruler of Zhou.
结果没想到他们进入到文王的那个国界里面之后看到了一幅让他们非常感慨的景象就在街上人们都互相礼让，彬彬有礼。到了朝廷里面，这个大臣之间都非常融洽那么这个虞和芮两国的国君呢，他们当时看了以后就非常惭愧说我们在那里吵来吵去要争抢的东西，恰恰人家认为是可耻的东西我们赶紧不要去找文王了这丢人了我们还是回去自己解决吧结果他们回去以后就互谅互让，把这个问题呢化解。
To distinguish the difference between the various classes, different sets of bronze objects were used at banquets, celebrations, and at worship and funeral ceremonies. In any bronze set used for these purposes, the numbers of ding, a vessel for containing meat, and gui, a container for foods other than meat, were rigidly set according to class, and they were never to be confused. This rule about the numbers of vessels lay at the core of the rituals of the Western Zhou Dynasty. In accordance with the book Rituals of the Zhou Dynasty, the king was to use 9 ding and 8 gui, dukes and princes 5 ding and 4 gui, ministers 5 ding and 4 gui, and scholars 3 ding and 2 gui.
这个礼乐制度很重要的一点，它是要体现社会的层次的结构。是吧？你比方说我们说的这个，你比方说现在大家都说列鼎，是吧？说是这个用鼎的时候，这鼎本来就是一个吃饭的工具，是吧？特别是一种烹煮的一种器物，是吧？拿它炖肉、煮肉，是吧？那么这样的器物呢，可是你比方说天子就要用9鼎甚至加上3个陪鼎，所谓天子要用12鼎。是 是吧？那么天子为什么要有12鼎呢？是吧？他是不是能吃那么多？他也吃不了那么多，是吧？他是表现的他的社会地位。
It was not only the number of ding that marked the status of the owner, it was also the size. Through the bronze objects he used, an owner's social status, obligation and rights were clearly defined in an unequal society. But how was harmony and peace to be maintained in such an unequal society? The answer was through music. The rulers of this age believed that the function of music was to educate people. If the ruler and his subjects could sit down inside a temple to enjoy music together, the result would be a harmonious relationship between all of them. If a father and sons did the same at home, the family would be a good one. If all the members of a clan were willing to gather inside their village to listen to music, there would be no disputes. The music used in temples later gave rise to palace music, which was, of course, enjoyed by the ruler and his nobles only. Confucius, who was of a later generation, came to regard Zhou palace music as something that had come from heaven. On one occasion after listening to it, he said that one could forget the taste of the most delicious meat. In effect, Zhou Dynasty rulers aimed to use music concerts to maintain social order through arousing in everyone feelings of harmony, peace, and love.
"我们东方文化跟西方文化有一个根本的区别，就西方文化是宗教文化，就人的灵魂要上帝来管，所以每天要祈祷要做礼拜要忏悔甚至要用基督的血来洗刷自己的灵魂，才能得到拯救，因为在西方理论里面，人生下来是恶的。可是，在我们东方文化不然，我们不是一个宗教文化，我们的灵魂要靠自己来管，而且把它管好。那怎么管？就是靠道德来管。
Chinese civilization was unique in its use of the system of Li and Yue, a system that was known to all Zhou Dynasty people. The ancestors of the Zhou people, whose tribe was called Cathay, lived on the Yellow Plateau in China's west. Around the 12th century BC, their leader, Dan, led his people to the foot of Mount Qishan, and there, between present-day Fufang and Qishan counties in Shanxi province, they built a town which became their capital. That town was located at a place now named Zhouyuan, which means the source of the Zhou people. Many bronze objects have been unearthed in Zhouyuan to provide tangible evidence of the history of the Zhou people. In December 1976, Bai Xin-en, a farmer from Zhuangbai village, was levelling his field when suddenly he spotted some unusual objects. As soon as they heard of the farmer's finds, archaeologists from Zhouyuan rushed to the scene. As they carefully removed the earth, they realized they were uncovering layer after layer of neatly stacked bronze objects. In a single pit no more than 2 meters wide, the archaeologists found no less than 103 items, and this discovery was named the Zhuangbai No. 1 discovery. These bronze objects had belonged to a family of aristocrats named Wei that had been prominent during the Zhou Dynasty. From the inscriptions found on 74 of the pieces, the archaeologists determined that 8 workers had been involved in making them, and that work on them had begun in the early years of the Western Zhou and had continued for 200 years before they were finally completed. One of the objects bears 284 characters about a number of important events that took place in the early years of the Western Zhou Dynasty.
以青铜容器为中心，在世界上是可以说是独一无二的。第二个非常突出的是，这些青铜容器上往往有铭文、有文字，而且这文字的内容非常丰富。当然，多数是对自己祖先啊、对王的这个歌颂，但是它记载了很多重要的史实。
The characters on these objects reveal that the Wei family was large and wealthy. Every day, for example, they had their meals to the accompaniment of music produced from bronze musical instruments. We know that there were many such noble families in Zhouyuan. The bronze objects from the Zhuangbai No. 1 discovery had once been in a temple where they were used only on significant occasions, such as ceremonies to memorialize ancestors. The people of Zhou clearly had an awesome respect for their ancestors. All members of the royal family, as well as nobles, had a family temple for memorializing ancestors. But what did such a temple look like? In 1976, a major archaeological excavation carried out in Fengchu village, Qishan County, Shanxi Province, brought to light the remains of a 3,100-year-old building complex. This building complex was built along a central axis and occupied an area of around 1,470 square meters. Each of the 30 or so houses had 3 courtyards, with rooms laid out in a very orderly manner on the eastern and western sides. The builders of these houses made use of specialized tools to achieve accurate horizontal and vertical lines. A pole was erected, and a thread with a weight attached to its end was used to check if every line was straight. Then, using the pole as the central point, the builders checked if the circular shape was perfect by comparing shadows at sunrise and sunset. The line connecting the 2 points formed a straight east-west line. Before the invention of the compass, ancient Chinese workers determined direction through the shadow from a pole and horizontal level using water. This later led to the birth of a more accurate leveling instrument that we still find highly convenient today. According to archaeologists, these houses were part of a temple complex where major ceremonies were held. The earliest poetry book ever written in Chinese history, the Book of Songs, includes many descriptions of these ceremonies, and through them we learn that, to the accompaniment of musical instruments, Zhou people sang loudly to eulogize their ancestors. Of Shang had engaged in human sacrifice, but the Zhou people turned to domestic animals for sacrificial purposes. Ancestor worship had been a very important part of life since the Xia dynasty, and it had continued through Shang. But during the Zhou dynasty, ancestor worship ceremonies became even more frequent. These worship ceremonies served as a means to unite the people around the rulers.
祖先崇拜确实对中华民族的这种发展啊是具有重要的意义。比如说，中华民族都把皇帝 作为共同的人文始祖。当然，实际上，比如说真正是皇帝的直系子孙，那是人数是很有限的。但是，首先他是华夏的这个集团的祖先，另外呢，又实际上最后发展成为多元一体的中华民族的共同祖先。这对于文化的这种发展，对于社会的发展，对于国家的这种稳定，或者对中华民族的凝聚，都具有重要的意义。
In point of fact, the temple discovered in Fengzhou was just a very small part of the Zhou royal buildings. The remains of a much larger building complex have been found in Zhouyuan, constructed on a high-standing base. On either side of the base, there was a road paved with slab stones, on which stood huge pillars, spaced out in a very orderly manner. At the site, many broken tiles were found scattered about. According to historical records, tiles first appeared during the Xia dynasty a long time before the Zhou dynasty. But by the time of the Zhou dynasty, tile-making technology had matured, and this can be seen in the great variety of tiles produced in the Zhou dynasty. Some of these tiles were for roofs, others for decoration, and some bore patterns. Tiles went on to be very important to the development of traditional Chinese buildings. Interestingly, the tiles used for Ming and Qing palaces, glazed or unglazed, are little different in appearance from those used in the Zhou dynasty more than 3,000 years before. Zhou dynasty buildings embodied Li and Yue, the concepts that rigidly prescribed what a particular social class could and could not do. This rigid code was followed all the way down to the Ming and Qing dynasties, and can even be seen in the construction of the Forbidden City. But why did these two late dynasties still operate according to this ancient code several thousand years after it was developed?
孔子讲了，礼之用，和为贵。礼它可贵在什么地方呢？它就是营造一个和。我们人如果失去了礼，我们身上都是野性，这人就是不和谐的人。我们人跟人之间交往，古代是通过礼来尊重对方，然后获得对方对我的尊重。
Although the capital of the Western Zhou was in Fenghao, Zhouyuan was also an important place because it was the old hometown of the ancestors of the Zhou people and also the former capital. In Zhouyuan, there were many family temples and former royal palaces where the king held fairly regular worship ceremonies and received ministers and nobles. Every time a prince or a noble received an honor, a bronze object was made to commemorate the occasion. This was a practice not limited to Zhouyuan, but seen in other parts of the country as well.
距离周王朝统治中心，比如说千里之外，这样一些，比如说分封的这个诸侯国当中，出土的青铜器，往往和周王朝的这个首都附近的相当一致，无论是从纹饰到这个器型，就应该说它是周王朝分封制度所带来的最直接的结果，这种文化的一致性。
This identity and consistency meant a universal acceptance of the Zhou dynasty cultural, political, and ideological beliefs, and bronze objects were the vehicle used to spread them. The stories of legendary figures of ancient antiquity, such as Wang Di, Yao, Shun, and Da Yu, were adapted into musical performances to be staged at the highest level worship ceremonies. Among these special music dramas were the story of King Wu's punitive expedition against the cruel King Zhou of the Shang dynasty, and the story of the ancestors of Shang who brought about the downfall of the earlier Xia dynasty. During the Xia, Shang and Zhou dynasties, the multiple cultures of the Neolithic Age merged to become the core of Chinese culture. In the inscriptions found on some Western Zhou bronze objects, the word for China appears. This tells us that the political and cultural connotations of the word were accepted, and gradually it came to be accepted in all parts of the country.
那从夏代、商代起，就是讲礼啊。孔夫子讲啊，这个殷于夏礼，所审亦可知也。周殷于殷礼，就是说夏、商、周的礼是相互继承的。那么每一个朝代更换以后，可能对礼呢多少有点改变，有点修改，有点增加。这是有个传统的，这个中国的礼是有传统的，而这个礼表现在物质上呢，就是礼器。礼器的大部分呢是集中在青铜器上。
The integration of Li and Yue elevated music to a higher level, so it could function not only in social life, but also in political, military and educational fields. Along with bronze objects such as the ding and containers of other kinds, also found were bells used for musical performances. If the ding was the soul of Western Zhou ceremonies, these bronze bells made it flesh and blood. According to historical records, during the Western Zhou dynasty there were more than 70 types of musical instruments. Music was a part of life, and all nobles and scholars valued the ability to appreciate music. In the royal court, there was an official in charge of musical education, whose task it was to elevate the ability of aristocrats and scholars through music. The ruler hoped to make all of his subjects calm and peaceful, respectful to parents, and loyal to brothers and sisters through music. According to the ancient book Rituals of Zhou, 1,463 professional musicians worked for the royal family, and this number excluded the musicians hired from outside the court for special occasions. So far, no images of a music ensemble working for Western Zhou rulers have been found. However, an accidental discovery made in Sui-Shan County, Hubei province in the spring of 1978 gives us some insight as to just how magnificent such an ensemble must have been. After the earth and the massive cover was removed from the top of the tomb of Lord Yi, the ruler of the state of Zhang, a magnificent set of bronze chime bells was revealed. Among the 7,000 bronze items discovered, as many as 125 were music-related. It was the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century related to music. This set, made up of 65 pieces in all, was more than 2,400 years old when it was found, yet it was still hanging on its wooden frame in readiness for a performance. The largest of the 65 bells weighs over 200 kilograms, the lightest 2.4 kilograms. The entire set weighs more than 2.5 tons. Each bell bears an inscription, and in all, there are 2,800 characters. They tell of the high level achieved in music during the time of the Western Zhou Dynasty. This extraordinary set of bells, the only ancient musical instrument ever found anywhere in the world capable of producing its original sound, was also the earliest instrument to produce 12 semitones and 5 octaves. In Europe, such a feat was only achieved with the advent of the piano, but that was 2,300 years after this set was made. A special bell placed at the center of the set was found to be different from the others, and the inscription on the bell tells us about its source. The bell was a gift for Lord Yi from King Hui of the state of Chu for Lord Yi and his descendants to enjoy forever. This bell from King Hui of Chu is more than 90 centimeters tall and weighs about 135 kilograms. Yet compared with other bells, it's not particularly impressive in size. But then the relative size of the state of Zhang, ruled over by Lord Yi, needs to be borne in mind. Compared with its large and powerful neighbor, the state of Chu, the state of Zhang was very small. But if the life of the ruler of Zhang was this luxurious, how luxurious was the life of the ruler of the much larger state of Chu? In the palace of every state during the spring and autumn and warring states periods, a sizable music ensemble and a performance troupe were always ready on hand to perform at a moment's notice. Towards the late Western Zhou, due to social turbulence, many musicians left the royal music ensembles, and when they did, they took with them pieces of music that had previously been performed exclusively for royals and nobles. This royal music gradually became integrated with the music of society at large, and it continued in its function to educate.
中国的这个礼乐制度很重要的一点啊，就是它有一个基本的精神啊，它要讲和，是吧？啊，所谓和而不同啊，是吧？我们讲和，大家用和这个字，是吧？其实和这个字呢，在中国最早用的时候就是用在礼乐里面。啊，中国讲的这个礼乐之教，是吧？为什么要用礼乐来这作为教育一个重要的内容呢？就是因为它可以带一种啊这个和的啊这么一个观念。
After the concept of Li and Yue was established during the Zhou Dynasty, it quickly became the criterion for any social activity. It was a system that maintained social order, contributed to the stability of the 800-year-long Zhou Dynasty, and laid a solid foundation for the Cathay culture that would be established later in the Qin and Han dynasties. During the 2,000 years that followed, the system of Li and Yue never ceased to function. It continued to play an important part in Chinese history. The concept of Li and Yue became the foundation of Confucianism, in which people are encouraged to cultivate themselves while the government consolidates its power. It was also meant to build harmonious human relationships and was the #1 criterion for judging any activity. With the passing of time, many trends have come and gone, but belief in Li and Yue has remained throughout Chinese history.